One.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ta'ala wa barak wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-'aliyyil 'azim. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Al-Mukhtasar by Imam Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, we're still in the chapter of prayer, and we have reached the section of make-up prayers, qada. Now, make-up prayers, there's a few issues that relate to make-up prayers that Imam al-Quduri takes us through. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, that وَمَنْ فَاتَتُ صَلَاتٌ قَضَاهَا إِذَا ذَكَرَهَا. If a person misses a prayer, then they should make it up whenever they remember it. One of the words that is used for missed prayers is al-fawa'id. And the word missed prayers is used, right? It's a type of good opinion with the believers, right? Because a missed prayer has a connotation of being unintentional, right? As opposed to al-matrukat, right? The left prayers that were left. Right? So the idea is that the believer would not leave any prayer intentionally. That the believer would strive to pray the prayers on time, as we mentioned before, that each prayer has been prescribed at a specific time. But things happen. People oversleep, you become busy in the world, and you may forget. Right? Nisyan. Right? So soon as a person, the principle is that soon as you recall that you forgot the prayer, you should make it up. Soon as you recall that you forgot the prayer, you should make it up. The same thing, like if you wake up for the Fajr prayer and it's already out, and then one should hasten to make it up. Right? Obviously, you would have to wait until the sun fully rises until you make it up. Right? But at the first possible opportunity, one should strive to make it up. Right, so he says, right, he starts with that, and then he goes into another issue, the issue of tartib. Now, tartib means to pray the prayers in order. So just as it is obligatory to pray Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, and it's necessary to pray Witr, it is likewise obligatory to pray them in order, in that same exact order. Fajr, then Dhuhr, then Asr, then Maghrib, then Isha. So if a person forgets Fajr, it's obligatory for them to pray Fajr before they pray Dhuhr. Because if they pray Dhuhr before praying Fajr, right, the Dhuhr may not count. The Dhuhr may not count. So it is obligatory to pray them in order. Now this order is obligatory between the obligatory prayers themselves, the current obligatory prayers, as well as the missed prayers in relationship to the current prayers. Right, so you have a missed Fajr, you can't pray a current Dhuhr until that Fajr is made up, because it has to come first. But there are three exceptions. There are three exceptions that allow one to not make up the prayer and to pray the current prayer first, and then later on to pray the missed prayer. There are three exceptions. Right, so the first exception is that the time is tight. The time is constricted. You're running out of time. So for instance, you wake up after the time of Fajr has already finished. So you owe a Fajr. Right? And the criteria is that you owe that Fajr before you can pray Dhuhr. But imagine something happened, you became busy, and you weren't able to pray Fajr early or ahead of Dhuhr time. Then Dhuhr time came in, and you're at work, and now there's only 5 minutes left till Asr. Right, so now if you pray Fajr first, then you might not be able to pray Dhuhr in its proper time. Right? So you have to pray Dhuhr first, because there's no point in trying to make up for a missed prayer which causes you to miss a current prayer. Right? The current prayer has precedence in that case. Now that applies obviously to the time of the current prayer going out. You fear that you have reasonable surety that if I pray this prayer before the current prayer, I'm going to miss both. I'm going to miss the time. That's obvious. But it also applies to the recommended time, of the current prayer. So for instance, you were at work, something happened, things got busy, you completely forgot to pray the Dhuhr. Now it's Asr time. And you're on the bus home, but then the bus got stuck in some traffic, and now you finally get home, and it's just before the disliked time at the end of the Asr time. So when the sun becomes weakened, the brightness of the sun becomes weak, just before Maghrib, that time is disliked time. So you have a choice. You pray Asr right away, and your Asr is in the perfect timing. Or you pray your Dhuhr first, and then your Asr ends up being in a disliked time. Right? In that case, you give preference to the Asr prayer. Right? So if you fear that the time is going to go out, or that the recommended time is going to go out, and it's going to enter into a disliked time, then you give precedence to the current prayer over the missed prayer, and it's valid. So that's the first exception. The second exception is if you forgot. So for instance, you woke up after Fajr time finished. Then you said, okay, after I get ready for work, then I'm going to quickly pray Fajr and then leave. But just before you did that, your boss called and said they need you in an extra 15 minutes early. So you completely lost track that you wanted to pray Fajr and you left. Right? And you completely forgot. Then you started on your lunch break, you started to pray the Dhuhr prayer, and you prayed the whole Dhuhr prayer, and then after the prayer, you realized, wait, I never prayed Fajr. Right? That forgetfulness is overlooked. It's excused. That Dhuhr prayer counts, right? Because you forgot. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Rufi'at al-aqlamu an," that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has lifted the pen from the person who forgets. Right? There are many different narrations of the hadith. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah has forgiven my ummah for that which they forgot. Right? Al-khata'u wa nasyan, accidents and forgetfulness. Right? So the prayer is valid. However, if mid-Dhuhr prayer you remembered that you have a Fajr prayer that's due, the Dhuhr prayer breaks and you have to pray the Fajr prayer. Right? Because now you're not forgetful. You have to stop you have to leave the Dhuhr prayer and then pray the Fajr prayer. You have to leave the Dhuhr prayer and pray the Fajr prayer first. If you were to continue the Dhuhr prayer, it would technically be valid. Right? However, if you went and made up your Fajr prayer after that, then you would have to repeat the Dhuhr. Right? So this is a rare situation called a salat al-mawqufa. That's it. That your prayer is in limbo. It's kind of here or there. So if you end up making up that Fajr prayer, you have to pray the Dhuhr again. But if you prayed 6 salats in a row, then all of them will be valid. It's a weird issue. But it's right. So, but if you remember mid prayer, you have to break the prayer and start over. So if you're at the masjid in Jama'ah, and then you realize, oh wait, I have a Fajr prayer, right? You would quickly leave that prayer, pray the Fajr, and then rejoin it. You leave the prayer, pray Fajr, and then rejoin the prayer. Right? Likewise, right, you missed the Fajr prayer on the day of Jum'ah. So right before the Jum'ah prayer, right, you realize, oh wait, I didn't pray my Fajr. So in that case, you're allowed to pray even if the khutbah is going on. Even if the khutbah is going on, obviously you should try to hide in such a way that people won't see you or accuse you of anything. But you would have to pray that Dhuhr before you can pray the Jum'ah. So that's the second. If you prayed the entire prayer without even realizing, in a state of forgetfulness of the missed prayer that you owe, that prayer is valid, and the forgetfulness is excused. The last one is that there's an undue hardship in praying the missed prayers first. So, and the definition of undue hardship in that case is that the amount of missed prayers that you owe is six obligatory prayers. That you've missed 6 obligatory prayers, then it would be unduly difficult for you to pray all of them first before you can pray the current prayer. Right? Because now you've missed, say you missed Fajr, then you missed Dhuhr, you missed Asr, you missed Maghrib, you missed an Isha. Once the next Fajr comes in, right, and the time of that next Fajr goes out, then you have a repetition. You have 2 Fajrs there. So that's the proof of difficulty, that there's a repetition of how many prayers you owe. Right, so if you owe 6 or more prayers, obligatory prayers, so the witr prayer does not count in these 6, even though it's obligatory to do the witr prayer in order. Right, but if you owe 6 obligatory prayers, then you are no longer obliged to pray things in order. You can make up the missed prayers out of order, and you can pray your current prayers before making up the missed prayers. Right? However, again, there's a huge encouragement to pray any missed prayers right away, as soon as possible. So if someone does have a backlog of many prayers, then they should start to chip away at that as best as possible. To first decide on what is the number of prayers that I've missed. Right? Estimate, if you have to, use your reasonable surety. Okay, it's been this long. It's been about 5 months that I didn't pray, right? Or a certain period of time since I became mature. There's about a 5-month gap that I didn't pray. Okay, how many prayers are in a day? How many days are in a month? Right, times by 5 months. This is the amount of prayers that I think that I missed. Add a little bit just to be sure, right? And then to start chipping away at them as best as one can. But in that time, one does not have to do all of that before they can pray the next current prayer. Right? They are excused from the order. They're excused from the order. Now, that they remain in that state where the order is not obligatory on them until they make up all their prayers entirely. Once they get back to 0 missed prayers, the order becomes obligatory on them again. So for instance, Brother Zubair, there was about 5 months of time where he had some really bad friends and he stopped praying, right? Because they used to make fun of him. But then he realized how foolish it was for him to neglect Allah for the sake of some friends who don't really care about him anyway. So he made tawbah, right? And he started to chip away at the 5 months of prayers. So say it was a few hundred prayers. So he chipped away at his 150 missed prayers. And then he got it down to 5 prayers. Right? Still, he doesn't have to pray in order. He doesn't have to make them up before the next prayer. Right? He gets it down to 3 prayers, down to 2 prayers. Then he's got down to 1 prayer. He's got 1 prayer left. Still, he doesn't have to pray in order. But if he gets to 0, if he makes that 1 prayer up, right, then the next prayer that he misses, he has to pray that before the next current prayer. Right? Now he's back and obliged to do the order once again. So he's called Sahibut Tartib, right? The person who is obliged to pray in order. Right? So those are the 3 excuses. Right? If you made up the missed prayer, the time of the current prayer will either go out completely or it will enter into a disliked time. You pray the current prayer first. Or you pray a current prayer and you completely forgot that you have a missed prayer due, that prayer is valid. Right? As long as you recalled it after you already finished it. If you called it during the prayer, you break the prayer and you make up the missed prayer and you start over. Or the amount of prayers that you owe is 6 or more. 6 or more. The next issue he talks about is the disliked times of prayers. Right? So we kind of alluded to that just now, that if you fear that the current prayer is going to enter into a disliked time, then you give preference to the current prayer over the missed prayer. So, but what are the disliked times? He tells us, And there are a few different ways to break down the disliked times. Right, so there's times that are disliked in and of themselves because the actual time has a meaning in it that is disliked. And there are also other times that are disliked for some secondary reason. Okay, tamam. Right, so the times that are disliked in and of themselves, right, it is any prayer that that you become responsible for, either obligatory or necessary, before that time entered. If you were to pray that prayer in the time, this disliked time, the prayer does not count. The prayer does not count. Okay, so for instance, example, someone missed the Dhuhr prayer. Okay? And then, right, as we'll see, the ending time of Asr prayer is disliked. The ending time of Asr prayer is disliked when the sun is just about to set. So if they want to pray Dhuhr prayer at that time, if they prayed that Dhuhr prayer, missed the Dhuhr prayer at that time, the prayer does not count. Right, why? Right, because the Dhuhr prayer became obligatory on them before that time came in. Right. So you can consider that a missed prayer is considered an obligation of that complete prayer. And a complete prayer has to be prayed in a complete time, whereas the disliked time is a deficient time. So if you pray a complete prayer in a deficient time, it doesn't count. It doesn't count. Right, so what are the 3 times? Right, the first is when the sun rises, so when the crescent, or what's the sphere of the sun peaks over the horizon until it fully rises a spear's length or 2 spears' length, which is about 14 minutes, 14 to 16 minutes after the sun already peaked over the horizon. Right, so in that time, like for instance, you overslept for Fajr. Right? So the Fajr time's out. The sun peaked over the horizon, Fajr time's done. Right? Fajr became obligatory on you before the sun peaked over the horizon, before that time entered. For you to pray that Fajr prayer in that time does not count. Right? While the sun is rising, until it has fully risen. Once it has fully risen, then you can make up the Fajr prayer, because now it's back to a complete time, not a deficient time. Right? The same thing applies to the time just before the Dhuhr prayer, which is called just before Zawal. So Zawal initiates the beginning of the Dhuhr prayer when the sun starts to decline from its zenith. While the sun is at its zenith, it is prohibited to pray. It's prohibited to pray while the sun is at its zenith. So if you pray a prayer that became obligatory on you before that time entered, so say a missed Fajr prayer or something, right, at that time, that prayer does not count. Right, so prayers that entered one's responsibility before the time are not valid in the following 3 times. Right, when the sunrise until it fully has risen, or when the sun is at its zenith until it declines, initiating the start of Dhuhr time, or when the sun is setting until it fully sets. Right, so the last one is when the sun becomes weak enough that you could look at it and your eyes don't hurt. Right, that's the end of Asr time, right, approaching the beginning of Maghrib time, approaching the sunset. The exception is the Asr of that day. The Asr of that day. Right, so if you delay the current Asr until the disliked time, the prayer still counts. The prayer counts, but it's disliked. It's prohibitively disliked to delay it to that time without an excuse. And if it's habitual, the excuse is disregarded, because excuses do not remain to be excuses if they're habitual. Right? How many times are you going to use the excuse that you got caught in traffic? Leave earlier, right? Or plan something ahead of time. Okay, tamam. So these 3 times are disliked in and of themselves. The reason being that these are the 3 times in which the polytheist would worship the sun. They would worship the sun in those times, and we are commanded to not show any resemblance to them. So we do not pray in those times. And because of that prohibition, that time is considered a deficient time. Right? So to pray a prayer in a deficient time is not permissible. Right? If that prayer became obligatory on you before that time entered. So that applies to the missed prayer. It also applies to the sajda tilawa, the prostration of recitation. Right? So for instance, say after Dhuhr prayer you're reading Quran and you read a verse of prostration. Right? You cannot make that prostration right before the sun is setting. Right? Because it became obligatory on you before that time entered. Right? And you cannot perform something that became obligatory on you before the time entered in that time, or any of these 3 times. It does apply to the janazah prayer as well. However, there's a reconciliation between 2 disliked things. Right? It is disliked if, say for instance, the body is ready. When the body is ready, the prayer can be prayed. So the body is ready well before the disliked time, just before Maghrib comes in. Right? Can you pray? Right. So now the obligation of the janazah prayer was on you before that time entered. Right? The legal reasoning would say that you should not be able to pray it in that time. But the other problem is, it is also disliked to delay the janazah prayer. Right? So for that reason, if someone is in that situation, it's better to pray it than to delay it. It's better to pray it, even if it's disliked, and it will be valid, and it doesn't. Right? And it's better than delaying the janazah prayer. Right? If you can plan ahead of time, that once the body is ready, right, to make the body ready at a time when it's not disliked, that's the best. So anything that becomes obligatory before these, in your responsibility, before these times enter, you cannot pray that thing in that time, in these disliked times. Because these times are disliked in and of themselves. Therefore, they are deficient. And you cannot pray a complete thing in a deficient time. So, these other times are disliked for secondary reasons. They're disliked for secondary reasons. Right? So any prayers performed in these times, it would be valid. Right? They will be valid. However, to pray voluntary prayers in these times is prohibitively disliked, even though they are valid. Right? So after the Fajr prayer is performed, right, after you pray the Fajr prayer, right, you're not allowed to pray any voluntary prayers whatsoever. Right? It is disliked to pray any voluntary prayers because that time is supposed to be for remembrance of Allah and recitation of Quran and other things besides the prayer, besides praying. Right, so to pray any voluntary prayers is prohibitively disliked. However, you can make up obligatory prayers. You can do make-up prayers, you can make up a wajib prayer, you can do, so you can pray obligatory or necessary prayers, but you cannot pray any voluntary prayers in that time. Same thing applies to after performing the Asr prayer. So there's 2 separate things. One is the end of Asr time, and the other one is after you pray Asr. So say you pray Asr as soon as it comes in. Right? Then you can't pray any voluntary prayers after that. But you can pray make-up prayers up until the sun starts to weaken. Because that time is prohibitively disliked in and of itself. So after the Asr prayer, and this is why in the Hanafi school it's better to delay the Asr prayer until just before the sun starts to weaken, so that you allow yourself more space to pray voluntary prayers prior to the Fajr, the Asr prayer. So you can pray your Sunnah, you can pray 4 rakats before Asr, you can pray some Nafl prayers, you can do a lot of things before Asr. Then once you pray Asr, no more Nafl. So if you delay the Asr, you have more room for Nafl prayers, for voluntary prayers. If you pray Asr right away, then you have that whole period where you can't pray. Right? You can't pray any voluntary prayers. The third one is before the Fajr prayer, except for the two Sunnah prayers of Fajr, the 2 units of Sunnah for Fajr prayer. So once the Fajr prayer enters, the time enters, the only thing that is that is on you to do is the Sunnah of Fajr. The 2 rakats of Sunnah, the emphasized Sunnah of Fajr, that's it. That's it. Right. So, say you prayed your 2 rakats of Sunnah before Fajr, it's disliked to pray anything else until you actually pray the Fajr prayer. Right, because that time is specifically just for those 2 things, the Sunnah and the Fard. 2 rakats, that's it. No more, no less. And then the 4th one is before Maghrib prayer. Right, to pray the Sunnah before Maghrib prayer is disliked because delaying the Sunnah of Maghrib is to pray Maghrib immediately as soon as the time comes in, without any delay. If you were to stop and pray the voluntary prayers before the Maghrib, it would necessitate a delay of the Maghrib prayer. So for that reason, it's disliked. However, the scholars have mentioned that if you're going to a masjid, and the masjid, right, it's set up that they allow 5 minutes or so for people to get ready for the prayer or to come for the prayer, and then they pray. So they give the adhan and then they wait 5 minutes. If they're going to wait 5 minutes anyway, regardless of what you do or not, then some scholars said that just pray Sunnah. Right? It's good to pray the Sunnah. Some scholars said no. Right? The fact that they delay the prayer, that's on them. I'm not praying because that's our school, and both of those are right. Right? Both of those are right, and either one can be acted upon. So if you're very principled, don't pray. Right? If you're more of a if you're more about keeping the unity of the masjid, and then go ahead and pray. It's up to you. Right? But for you to delay the prayer, right, in and of yourself, so say you're praying at home and you're the imam, right? Just pray the fard right away because that's the Sunnah. Don't pray the Sunnah after the fard. After the adhan, pray the fard right away. Right, so that kind of concludes the idea of the disliked prayers. The disliked times. So the 3 times that are disliked in and of themselves, you cannot pray anything in them that had already become obligatory on you before they entered. The other times, you can't pray voluntary prayers in them. Although they'll be valid, it will be sinful to do so. But you can pray obligatory prayers in those times, obviously with the exception of before the Maghrib prayer, because then you're definitely delaying still. You're delaying the prayer. So then he takes us into a very important chapter, which is the Babun Nawafil. Now, Nafl, the word Nafl, comes from the word ziyada, which means extra. Nafl, what we call voluntary prayers, means extra. So if you use it in the literal sense, right, anything that is extra from the obligatory prayers is Nafl. Right, so linguistically, you could call a Sunnah prayer Nafl, linguistically. However, the general terminology of the books of law is that Nafl are the recommended prayers, right, and not the emphasized Sunnah prayer. So they make a distinction. If it's an emphasized Sunnah prayer of the Prophet that he always prayed, they call it a Sunnah prayer. And the other prayers where he prayed once in a while, here and there, he left sometimes, he did it sometimes, they're called Nafl or Mustahab. They're called voluntary or recommended prayers. Right? However, the linguistic meaning allows it to apply to both the Sunnah and the voluntary prayers. Right? So Imam al-Quduri, he titles the chapter of Nawafil, of additional prayers. Right? And in the chapter he talks about Sunnah and what we know as Nafl prayer. Right? The Sunnah prayers as well as the recommended prayers. Right? So there's no real discrepancy here. Rather, he's using the meaning in a linguistic sense, not as a terminology, right? Not in a terminological sense. Right, so you can break up the prayers into 4 main categories. You have the obligatory prayers, you have the necessary prayers, then you have the rest. So those are the additional prayers, right? You have the emphasized sunnah prayers, and then you have the non-emphasized sunnah prayers. So the non-emphasized sunnah prayers are considered recommended. They're like Nafl. Right? And then you have the voluntary prayers that you just prayed, however you want. It's not specifically because the Prophet did it, but you just want to pray. And the Prophet, it's a general sunnah. The Prophet said, "As-salatu khayru mawdu'." Right? The prayer is the best of affairs. The prayer is the best of affairs. So whoever wants to do a lot of it, do a lot of it. And whoever wants to do less, do less. Right? So the obligatory we talked about. The necessary, which is the witr prayer. Right? The emphasized sunnah we are describing now. So the emphasized sunnah prayers are, in the Hanafi school, 12 rak'ahs. A total 12 rak'ahs throughout the day. And the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned in the hadith, that whoever prays 12 rak'ats every day, then a house will be built for them in Jannah. Whoever prays 12 rak'ats every day, then a house will be built for them in Jannah. And that's obviously understood to be excluding the fard and the wajib. I mean, 12 voluntary prayers every day. And they are the emphasized sunnahs. They are the ones that the Prophet always did and rarely left unless he had an excuse. The most emphasized amongst them is the 2 rak'ats before Fajr. The 2 rak'ats of Sunnah before Fajr. The Prophet ﷺ, even if he had an excuse, he still didn't leave these. Even when he was traveling, he would pray them. And he would actually, as opposed to the other types of Sunnahs, he would get down from his camel, if he was traveling, and pray them on the ground. Right? So that's extra emphasis, because he would pray his 2 rak'ats after Maghrib on the camel. His 2 rak'ats after Isha on the camel. He would sit on the camel while praying them. If you're a traveler, you can do that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the Fajr prayer, he would get down. So some of the scholars said it's very close to necessary. It's very emphasized. Right? So, right, for that reason, the scholars have shunned away from allowing the person to pray the 2 rak'ats of before Fajr sitting. Even though it's allowed in all of the sunnah prayers and the voluntary prayers besides these, right? Because it's so emphasized. The next is the 4 rak'ats before Dhuhr prayer. The 4 rak'ats before Dhuhr prayer. Then the 4 rak'ats, and then after Dhuhr is 2 rak'ats. 2 rak'ats after the Dhuhr prayer. So 4 before, 2 after, a total of 10. So 4, then the 4 of the obligatory, of the Dhuhr prayer itself, and then 2 afterwards. The next is 2 after Maghrib, and then final is the 2 after Isha. Those are the most emphasized prayers. So that's 2, 4, 6, 10, 12. 12 rak'ahs. The most emphasized prayers. And we already talked about the ruling of an emphasized sunnah, that to leave an emphasized sunnah once is blameworthy unless it's with an excuse. If it's with an excuse, a valid excuse, something really pressing, somebody needs to go to the hospital, or right, and you leave it, then it's not disliked. But if you leave it without an excuse, then it's blameworthy, but it's not sinful. It's somewhat disliked, it's blameworthy, but not sinful. But if you leave it constantly, habitually, without excuse, then it becomes sinful. Right, so these 12 prayers, one should strive to be consistent in doing them, and the amount of rewards in them, as narrated by many hadith, are amazing. Besides these 12 prayers, the remaining prayers are considered non-emphasized sunnahs, which is synonymous to the recommended prayers. And there's many different terms that mean the same thing. So you can call it a sunnah ghayrun muakkada, non-emphasized sunnah. You can call it mustahabbats, the mustahab sunnas, the mustahab prayers, the recommended prayers. You can call them nafl, voluntary prayers. You can call them mandubats, also another name for recommended. All of them meaning the same thing. These are prayers that the Prophet would do occasionally, and sometimes he would not do them occasionally. Without excuse, he would leave them. But the more of these that we can implement after being consistent on the first 12, then we should start to implement these to really complete our offering to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of our prayers. So they are an extra 2 after dhuhr. Okay, the Prophet said, whoever prays 4 rakats before dhuhr and 4 rakats after dhuhr, then, if I'm not mistaken, the narration kind of slips my mind, but I believe it's then all of their past and present sins will be forgiven. Something of that sort. Right, so we know that 2 after dhuhr are emphasized, sunnah. Right, and then you have an additional 2 after dhuhr that are non-emphasized. You can pray them all in one shot as 4 rakats. You're allowed to. Right, so the first 2 will count as the emphasized, the second 2 will count as the voluntary, or you can pray them separate. 2, then salam, and then another 2. Then the 4 rakats before asr. 4 rakats before the asr prayer. The Prophet said, رَحِمَ اللَّهُ امْرَئٍ صَلَّى قَبْلَ الْعَصْرِ أَرْبَعًا. May Allah have, you can translate this in a few different ways. May Allah have mercy on the person who prays 4 rakats before asr, or Allah will have mercy on the person who prays 4 rakats before asr. So it's either a dua or it's ikhbar. He's telling us. In another narration, the Prophet said that I just recalled that whoever prays 4 rakats before dhuhr and 4 rakats after dhuhr, wajabat lahum shafa'ati. My intercession is necessary for them. They will acquire my intercession necessarily. So the next one is 6 rakats after maghrib. 6 rakats after maghrib, and this is known as salatul awwabin, the prayer of the penitent, those who repent. And the Prophet said, "Man salla ba'd al-asri sittan min ghayri." He said, whoever prays after maghrib prayer 6 rak'ahs without speaking of anything worldly in between them, then يَعْدِلْنَ ثِنْتَيْنِ سَنَةً مِنَ الْعِبَادَةِ. Then it equals to 12 years of worship. It equals 12 years of worship. This is an amazing treasure chest of a prayer. Right, now, we know that 2 after maghrib is emphasized, sunnah. Right, so, and the Prophet ﷺ in that hadith we just quoted said, whoever prays after maghrib 6. 6, right? So, because the hadith is general, whoever prays 6, meaning 6 rak'ahs, whoever prays 6 rak'ahs. Since the hadith is general, you can pray 2 rak'ahs of the emphasized sunnah, and additional 4 to follow it. That will suffice as all 6. So you've kind of subsumed your emphasized sunnah into the 6. Right, and then that should be prayed 2, 2, 2. 2, 2, 2. So, right, without speaking any worldly speech in between the 2. I remember in Tarim, I was there for less than a week. Well, besides the dawrah, this is like after the dawrah finished, I was there, right, starting the actual classes for less than a week, and I wanted to ask Habib Umar about my classes. So I saw him sitting there by himself. No one's near him, and this is very rare. Usually people are crowding around him to ask him things. So I just stroll over with my schedule, and I sit down next to him and I ask him. And he just looks at me, right? Because he already prayed 2 rakats of his sunnah after maghrib. Right? And he was and they always pray their awabin every single day in and day out, every single day without fail. They pray 6 in a row, and they don't speak to anybody in the middle. But I'm this new student. I come and I sit next to him and I say, Habib, can you look at my schedule? And he just looks at me. You don't really know what's going on right now, do you? Right? It was quite funny. Later on, I realized, because everyone who was looking at me like, are you crazy? Right? But Habib knew that I didn't know, so he answered my question, and then he went to pray on his. But it wasn't worldly speech anyway. right? Right. So not to speak in between, right? And then 4 rakats after Isha. Again, 2 of them are emphasized. You can just subsume the 2 into the 4. So you can pray 4 after Isha, 2, 2. The first 2 will be emphasized. The second 2 will be your non-emphasized sunnah. Right. So sorry, there's 4 before Isha, and then 2 after, an extra 2 after Isha. So 4 before and an extra 2 after. The extra 2 after would be after the emphasized sunnahs. So those are the total, right? Those are, right? On top of that, there are other prayers that are recommended, like the duha prayer, the midday prayer, the tahajjud prayer, right? And then you have prayers that are circumstantial, like the 2 rakats after making wudu, before the limbs dry. This is the prayer that the Prophet said about Bilal, that I heard your footsteps in Jannah. And he asked them, what is the most hopeful deed that you did, O Bilal? So Bilal said that every time I make wudu, I pray 2 rakats. That's the sunnah of wudu, the sunnah prayer of wudu, to pray it before the limbs dry. You have also the dua of istikhara, seeking good or seeking guidance. You have the dua of haja, you have the prayer of need. And you can see the seeker's website with full details on both of them, and have a few readers on each of them. Okay, so to move on, he brings some miscellaneous rulings related to the voluntary prayers. Alhamdulillah. Right, so the sunnah prayers of the day, if you're praying voluntary prayers in the daytime, then you should either pray them 2 by 2, so 2 salam, 2 salam, 2 salam, and you are allowed to pray 4 at once, so 4 salam, 4 salam. You can do that as well. So you can pray them in pairs of 2, or you can pray them in groups of 4 rakats each, and that is valid. However, to pray any more than 4 rakats each at one shot is disliked. So if you want to pray 6 rakats in a row and then 1 salam, that's disliked. Right? 4 is the maximum if in one go. Right? However, generally voluntary prayers are seen as that every 2 rakats is an individual prayer. Every 2 rakats is an individual prayer. Right? So for that reason, if you're going to pray 2 rakats and then you're going to pray another 2 after it, you have the choice of finishing the 2 and then restarting another 2, or you can connect them. But if you connect them, then it's still sunnah to finish after the tashahhud, to say the dua, and then the prayer on the Prophet ﷺ, the dua, and then to stand up, right? By saying Allahu Akbar, you stand up, and then you do the beginning of a new salat. So you say Subhanakallahumma bihamdika tabaraka ismuka wa ta'ala, then your A'udhu Billah, then your Bismillah, the same way that we've discussed. Right? So you're taking them as 2 separate prayers, but they're just attached. You just didn't make salam after the first one. Tamam. But to do more than 4 at once, right, would be disliked. Now if it's a night prayer, there's a slight difference of opinion. Generally, one should stick to praying 2 at a time, 2, 2, 2, 2, right? Because there's an agreement on that. According to Imam Abu Hanifa, you could pray 8 in a row and then make 1 salam, and that's fine at night for voluntary prayers of night. But his students disagreed, and they said, no, you have to pray 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. So if one prayed 2 by 2 by 2, then there's no doubts that their prayers are correct, and there's no dislike. Right? But the opinion of the Imam has precedence, right? And it is allowed. It is allowed because the longer you stay in the tahrima, the more reward you have, because it's difficult, and to the extent of the difficulty, the reward is increased. Right. Now, just a side issue that is not mentioned here, but if a person is going to pray voluntary prayers, for instance at night specifically, then it is more virtuous to stand longer in each rak'ah than it is to make a lot of sajdas, than it is to make a lot of prostrations. So for instance, you say you have 1 hour. You have 1 hour. You can either read, say you want to read 1 juz of Quran. Right? You can either read 1 page, and then per rak'ah, right? And then just page, so then you have a lot of sajdas. You're going to pray 30 rakats or 20 rakats in that time. Right? But it would be better for you to read the whole juz in 1 rak'ah, or half the juz in 1 rak'ah, half the juz in another rak'ah. So you're only praying 2 rak'ahs, but your standings are much longer. So it's more virtuous to have longer standings than to have more rak'ahs. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said that أَفْضَلُ الصَّلَاةِ طُولُ الْقُنُوتِ. The best of prayers is the longest standing. Right? And there's discussion on both ends as well. Right? But the best prayer, and the Prophet ﷺ's prayer definitely mirrors this, that he would stand exceptionally long times, right, in one prayer, reading almost 7 juz in one prayer, and then in 1 rak'ah, and then another 7 in the second rak'ah. Tamam. If there's any questions on those sections, we're kind of transitioning now to a different topic of recitation. But if there's any questions, someone can just jump in. Right? Don't be shy. Right, so then he takes us into recitation. Some of this has already been mentioned when we talked about the prayer in its full form. Right, so reciting in the prayer something of the Quran is obligatory. Right, something of the Quran is obligatory in each of the first 2 in 2 rakats of the prayer. So if it's only a 2 rakat prayer, that means every rakat. Right? So that's the obligation. Right? If somebody is, for instance, a new convert, then what you should aim to do is to teach them one verse, because then at least they can pray the prayer and fulfill the obligation. And then after that, you can teach them 3 verses and a whole surah, and then so forth. Right? But it is necessary, right, to recite in the first 2 rakats. The first 2 rakats. So it's obligatory to recite in any 2 rakats of the prayer, but it's necessary to make those 2 rakats, specifically the first 2. Specifically the first 2. So if you're praying dhuhr, for instance, right, it is necessary to recite in the first 2 rakats as opposed to the last 2. Right? But say, for instance, you were completely just not present. You're so worried, you have all these things going on, and you didn't recite at all in the first 2 rakats. Right? You can still salvage the prayer by reciting in the last 2 rakats, because you fulfilled the obligation and you just missed the necessary action. But you would have to pray the prostration, make the prostration of forgetfulness. Right? Now, if it's only 2 rakats and you didn't recite in any of them, then the prayer doesn't count. So it's necessary to recite in the first 2 rakats, but the last rak'ah, if it's maghrib, or the last 2 rakats, if it's other than that, you have a choice either to read the Fatiha only, or to make tasbih, say subhanallah, 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 or to just stand silently for a moment. Right? Because the last 2 rakats are not specifically for recitation. They are for dua, they are for supplication, right? And the Fatiha is still read as a supplication, not necessarily as recitation. So the sunnah, the best is to read the Fatiha in the last 2 rakats. So you pray the dhuhr prayer, first 2 rakats you read the Fatiha and a surah, Fatiha and a surah. The last 2 rakats you should just read the Fatiha. right? But you do have the choice, and it's not disliked if you were to just say Subhanallah, 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 and then go into ruku'. And then fourth rakat, Subhanallah, 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 and then go into ruku'. You're allowed to do that. Right? And the reason why we're mentioning this is not that you can learn bad etiquette by fiqh. Oh, I don't have to read Fatiha, and just say Subhanallah. No, don't let your nafs use fiqh as an excuse. But say, for instance, you need to take somebody to the hospital, right? And they're moaning in pain, but you know that if you don't pray your dhuhr now, you'll never be able to pray it. So you quickly pray 4 rakats. Right? You can, instead of reading Fatiha on the third and the fourth, just say Subhanallah, 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 Allahu Akbar, because you need to hurry to help this person. Right? You have an excuse. Right? But it is valid, and it's not necessarily disliked to not read the Fatiha, but to read Subhanallah, Subhanallah, Subhanallah. If you are the imam and you have people praying behind you who are from a different school of thoughts, then you should read the Fatiha, right? Because in the Shafi'i school, it's not valid if you don't read the Fatiha in every single rak'ah of every single prayer, no matter what the prayer is, even if it's a janazah. Tamam. Right, so that's in the obligatory prayer. So obligatory prayer, it's fard to read something of the Quran in 2 rakats of the prayer. In any 2 rakats of the prayer. It is necessary to make those 2 rakats, the first 2 rakats, and to read at least 3 verses or 1 long verse or 1 short surah. Now in the voluntary prayer, which includes the sunnah prayers, right, the sunnah and the voluntary prayers, and the witr prayer, it is obligatory, it is necessary to recite the Quran in every single rak'ah, to recite the Fatiha and the surah in every single rak'ah. So in the witr prayer, the 3rd rak'ah, you have to recite the Fatiha and another surah. If you're praying 4 voluntary rak'ahs, right, you have to read in all 4. If you're praying 8, you have to read in all 8. Right? Because every 2 rakats of a voluntary prayer or a sunnah prayer is seen as an individual prayer itself, even if you continue without salam. Right? So you have to read in every single rakat. It's like, because if there's only 2 rakats, then you have to read in 2 rakats. That's every rakat. And the wajib is very similar to both the fard and to the nafl. So out of caution, you read it every rakat as well. Tamam. I hope that's clear. The text is kind of terse, but if anyone has any questions, we can clarify further if necessary. And then he brings us to some miscellaneous rulings before we reach one of the most important chapters, or the most practical chapters, prostration of forgetfulness. Right. So he says that whoever initiates a Nafl prayer or a Sunnah prayer, then it becomes necessary to finish that prayer, to see that prayer to its end in a valid manner. So if you say, okay, I'm going to pray 2 rakats of tahajjud, Allahu Akbar, and then mid-prayer you say, you know what, I better run and hurry, eat suhoor, or else I'm not going to eat anything. If you break that prayer, mid-prayer, you don't see it to its end, right, then it's wajib, it's necessary to make that prayer up. It's necessary. So now that prayer initially was a voluntary prayer. It was not you didn't have to do it. But once you start it, you have to finish it. And if you don't finish it, you have to make it up. Right? And have to, meaning necessary. It's wajib. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, right, O you who believe, obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not render your deeds invalid. And do not render your deeds invalid. So any voluntary action that you initiate, knowingly at least, then it becomes necessary for you to see it to its valid completion. This applies to fasting as well. So if you start a fast, say it's Mondays and Thursdays, right? It's Monday, you want to do a sunnah fasting. So midway through the day, you're going on, you're fasting everything, then so-and-so, a friend of yours invites you over to their house for some really delicious unagi sushi, right? And they invite you to their house, you go there, and I'm fasting. And now they're offended because they worked really hard to make that, right, to get that sushi ready. And anyone who's made sushi is very difficult to do at home, right, alone. Unless you have Japanese blood, right? But so now he's offended. You are allowed to break your fast, first of all. And sometimes it may be precedence because you're a guest and they're a host, they have rights on you. So you can break that fast, but you have to make up that day of fasting because you started a voluntary, and once you started it, it becomes necessary to see it to its completion. Right? And if you break it midway, you have to make it up another day. Right? So same thing applies to any nafl, prayer or fasting. Right? So if you don't finish it in a valid manner, if you break the prayer mid-prayer, then it's necessary to repeat. The only difference is if you were mistaken. If you were mistaken. Right? So for instance, you prayed the Dhuhr prayer, then you prayed your Sunnas, but then you realize, wait, did I pray my Sunnas? Okay, let me start. And then mid-prayer you were like, oh wait, no, I did pray. Then you can break it, then because you started it with a wrong assumption that you didn't pray it. Right? Next he says فإن صلى 4 ركعات وقعد في الأوليين مقدار التشهد ثم أفسد الأخريين قضاء ركعتين. If a person starts a 4 rakat sunnah, a voluntary prayer or a sunnah prayer, they start 4 rakat sunnah prayer. Right? After they finish the first 2 rakats and they sit down, the amount of time that it takes to say the tashahhud, right? And then they break the prayer after that. Then they only have to make up two rak'ahs. They don't have to make up the entire 4, because voluntary prayers, meaning any prayer besides the obligatory and the necessary, are seen as every 2 rak'ahs is an individual prayer, even if you connect them. Right? So and the same thing applies, say for instance, I say, I want to pray tahajjud, and I'm really ambitious. I woke up all kinds of energy, and I say, I'm going to pray 100 rakats, Allahu Akbar. I intended 100 rakats of Nafl. May Allah give us all tawfiq to do that at least once in our life, or to at least have the yearning to be of those people who do that. Imam Haddad would do that every single day. He makes intention of 100 rakats, right? But then he realizes he has to break his prayer because some emergency happened. If he breaks the prayer, does he have to make up 100 rakats? No, only has to make up 2. Right? Because regardless of how many he intended, it's 2 at a time. Right? If he prayed the 2 and he sat down and then he stood for a third, standing for the third is as you initiated the next 2. Right? So if you break the prayer in middle of any group of prayer, any group of rak'ahs, then you have to make up just those 2. Right, so the example he's given here, a person intended 4 rak'ahs, they prayed the first 2, they sat down, right, and then they stood up, and then they broke the prayer. They only have to make up the second 2, because they stood up for the third and fourth, which initiates a new pair. Right, and they only have to make up that pair. Right, and if you understand the principle, then you understand the ruling in all of its fashions, which is that every 2 rakats is seen as one individual prayer. Every 2 rakats is seen as one individual prayer. And standing up to the next pair of the next 2 units is like saying Allahu Akbar and starting from the beginning. Right, so if I say Allahu Akbar, those are the 2 are obligatory on me. If I stand up to the third and fourth become obligatory. If I stand up to the fifth and sixth become obligatory on me. Right. Tamam. And then he says it's permissible to pray any voluntary prayer sitting. And that accounts even if it's midway during the prayer. So you started the prayer standing, then you know what? I'm tired. And you can sit down mid-prayer and continue your prayer from there. Right? That applies to any voluntary prayer. It is permissible to pray them sitting. However, the reward is half. You get half the reward according to the hadith of the Prophet. Right? لِلْقَاعِدِ نِصْفُ أَجْرٍ قَائِمٍ. For the one sitting, it has half the reward of the one standing. Now, if you're sitting, you have to. Sitting entails that you prostrate on the ground still. You still prostrate on the ground. Tamam. And that applies even if mid-prayer, and that applies even if you don't have an excuse. You just don't feel like standing. Right? Not because of pain or these things. If you sit down because of an excuse, you get the full reward. It's not half the reward anymore. Right? And then the last thing he mentions, that you are allowed to pray sitting in a conveyance or some sort of vehicle if you are outside the city limits, even if you're not a traveler. Right? If you're outside the city limits, you are allowed to pray on the conveyance, and you'll make your prostration and your bowing by head gestures. So you bow, and your head gesture for your prostration has to be lower than the one of bowing. And you're not obliged to face the qibla. Right? So say you're driving, right, and you leave the city limits of where you live, then you can pray Nafl while driving. Right? Don't get in an accident. Right? Let's say you're on an empty highway, it's duha time, it's mid-morning time. You know there's sunnah of mid-morning. I want to pray my sunnah. Okay, Allahu Akbar. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Rahman Rahim while driving. Right? Ruku' like this, sajda a little further. Finish. Right? You can do that. But inside the city limits, it's prohibitively disliked to do so. Tamam. We're going to try to do this next part a little quick because we're running on time. We will do a recap of it in the next class as well. So we don't want to do it so fast that it becomes confusing, but I think it's pretty straightforward. The prostration of forgetfulness, right? The prostration of forgetfulness, what is its place? Right? If you leave a necessary action in the prayer, we mentioned before that the obligatory actions of the prayer are like the skeleton of the prayer. There is no prayer without them. But the necessary action of the prayer are second in importance to that, such that if you leave off a necessary action, you can make up for it by the prostration of forgetfulness. Okay, so he talks about first, he says, sujood sahwi wajibun, that it is necessary to do the prostration of forgetfulness when anything or any necessary action is left. Now that's the general principle. Any necessary action is left. Right? That could be by adding a necessary action, or adding a certain action of the prayer. So for instance, instead of 1 ruku', you did 2. Instead of 2 sajdas, you did 4. You did 3. Okay, so that's adding to the prayer. Essentially, you left the necessary action because it's necessary to go from one thing to the next thing that's the rightful thing. If you add something, you've delayed that thing. Or by missing out something that is necessary. So Fatiha is necessary. If you don't read the Fatiha, you just said, Allahu Akbar, Qul huwallahu ahad. No Fatiha. You can make up for that at the end of the prayer. Or you missed the dua of witr, or the qunut dua, or whatever it may be, any necessary action which we took in the beginning. If you miss out any necessary action unintentionally, then you can make up for it with a prostration of forgetfulness, and that removes the sin of that action being missed. Right? It removes the deficiency that was caused by unintentionally leaving off that action. Intentionally leaving a wajib, right? It's necessary to repeat the prayer. If you intentionally leave it, I don't want to read Fatiha. Allahu Akbar. Qul huwallahu ahad. Right? You have to repeat that prayer. That prayer is, right? It's not going to bring the fruits of what you want the prayer to bring. Right? It's sinful to do so. Now, if you accidentally left off a necessary action and you forgot to do the prostration of forgetfulness, then it's also necessary to repeat the prayer. It's also necessary to repeat the prayer. Tamam. So the method, he says here, that it's 2 prostrations after 1 salam. So what you're going to do is, you're going to see the prayer all the way to its end, right? All the way to the end of the tashahhud, right? Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu rasuluhu. And then instead of continue, you say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah 1 time to the right, and then do 2 additional prostrations. And then once you come back, you repeat everything from the tashahhud all the way to the end, and then you finish the prayer. So when you come back, you have to repeat the tashahhud. At-tahiyyatu lillahi wa salawat. Right, then you do your prayer on the Prophet, then your dua, then you make your salam to leave the prayer. Tamam. Right, and that applies to leaving any necessary action, which also entails delaying the next action. Right, so just as it is necessary and obligatory to do certain actions in the prayer, it is necessary also to do them one after another in a sequence, right, without any undue delay in between them. So if a person, for instance, they're praying 4 rakats. After the first sitting, right, they say, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, kama sallayta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim. And they forgot, oh wait, I have to stand up for the 3rd rakat. So what they did, they delayed standing for the 3rd rakat. That is leaving it necessary, because it's necessary for you to stand immediately without any undue delay. And the scholars, they've defined the undue delay is that if you reach Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, if you reach the name Muhammad, right, then you've completed the sentence. And before that, the sentence is incomplete. So that's considered a little bit, and a little bit is excused. A little bit of a delay is excused, but a large delay is not excused. So you'd have to prostrate at the end of the prayer. And this shouldn't be a point of misgivings and doubts and worries. Likewise, it is necessary to read aloud in the Fajr prayer, in the Maghrib prayer, and in the Isha prayer if you are in congregation for the Imam. Right. If you're the Imam, then it's necessary to read aloud in Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha, and it's necessary to read quietly in Dhuhr and Asr. So if you do the opposite, you start reading out loud in Dhuhr prayer. If it's a tiny bit, it's excused. If it's a full verse, then you have to make the prostration of forgetfulness for doing that. So you can refer back to the section of the necessary actions of the prayer. If any of those are left or delayed or repeated unnecessarily, right, or missing, then that necessitates the prostration of forgetfulness. And then lastly, he says that if you're not the Imam, you're the follower, you're praying behind the Imam. If the Imam makes a mistake, meaning he leaves a necessary action, and he does the prostration of forgetfulness, you have to follow the Imam in the prostration of forgetfulness, even though you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't miss anything, you didn't do anything, you didn't omit anything. Right? You have to follow the Imam in their prostration of forgetfulness. Now, if the roles are switched, right, you're still the follower, right? But you forget a necessary action. Right? You forget a necessary action. So say you're praying, for instance, witr in Ramadan in congregation. You're praying the witr prayer in Ramadan in congregation. Right? And the 3rd rakat comes, and you forgot, you didn't read any qunut dua. You didn't read any dua, right, in the 3rd rakat for witr, the witr dua. Right? It's necessary to read the witr dua even for the follower. Right? It'll be quiet, but they still have to read it. Right? So now the Imam does not prostrate for forgetfulness for you. That's definite, because the Imam can't be the follower, because that's just a switching of the roles. Right? But you also don't make your own prostration of forgetfulness behind the Imam, because you are a follower. Right? You don't have any, right? You don't really have any autonomy in the situation. You're a follower, and you are restricted to what the imam does. You don't do your own thing, right? So, and you don't have to repeat that prayer. The imam's prayer is sufficient for the followers. Right? You can if you wish. You can if you wish, but you don't have to. Tamam. Now, if you're following, right, the only situation where the follower will make the prostration of forgetfulness for their own mistake is if you're following the imam, say for instance in dhuhr, but you missed the first rakat. You came in on the second rakat. Right, so you're praying with the imam, you prayed 3 rakats with the imam, and then you stand up to make up your 1 rakat. In that 1 rakat, you forgot Fatiha. In that 1 rakat that you're making up, you forgot Fatiha, you have to prostrate for forgetfulness for your own mistake in that 1 rakat, because in that 1 rakat you're seen as an individual prayer, not a follower. Right, so you're a follower with the imam for those 3 rakats, and then 1 rakat you're praying by yourself. So in that rakat, if you make a mistake, you would make the prostration of forgetfulness. Tamam. The next issue we wanted to cover, but I think we might not have time, unless they tell me I have time. 5 minutes, maybe 7. Right. Okay. All right, so let's cover it, because it does go together. It does relate to the prostration of forgetfulness, but we'll try to cover this quickly. And this is a common issue, and I'm sure many of us have had this happen to them, that if you're praying a 4 rakat prayer, for instance, right, the first sitting after the second rakat is necessary. It's a wajib, right? You pray the first rakat, then the second rakat. It's wajib to sit down and read the tashahhud. Right, to sit down and read the tashahhud, at-tahiyyatu lillahi wa salawatu, and then stand up for the 3rd and 4th rakat. Tamam. If you did not sit at all in that sitting, so your second rakat, you go into prostration, then you sit up, then you prostrate, and then you just stand straight up to the 3rd rakat. What do you do? Right, so if you remember that you're supposed to be sitting for the tashahhud, as you're getting up to the 3rd rakat, if you're closer to sitting already, you've only just a little bit stood up, and then you realize, no, I have to sit for the tashahhud. Right? If you're closer to the sitting, then you just return to the sitting position, and you don't have to make any prostration. Right? That slight lifting and raising toward the standing, right, is overlooked because it was little, because you're closer to sitting than you are to standing. Right? But if you're closer to standing than you are to sitting, right, or you're completely already stood to the 3rd rakat, then you continue the prayer as is, and you prostrate for forgetfulness for leaving the tashahhud, right, for leaving that sitting. Okay? So if you're already standing or closer to standing than sitting, then you don't return. You don't go back. Right? You continue the prayer. Right? So that's regarding the first sitting. Right? So if you recall, when you're closer to sitting, you return to the sitting position, and there's no prostration of forgetfulness upon you. Right? If you are closer to standing, right, or you are fully standing, then you continue the prayer. You just continue the 3rd rak'ah as normal, right? And then at the end of the prayer, you make your prostration of forgetfulness. And now this is all we're talking about, the obligatory prayer. The obligatory, the necessary prayer. Right? The second issue is a 4 rakat prayer, right? The 4 rakat prayer. Now the last sitting, right? The last sitting is obligatory. Right? It's obligatory. It's the skeleton of the prayer. It's an integral part of the prayer. Right? It's not just wajib. It's not just necessary, because a wajib can be made up for. The obligatory sitting at the last sitting is obligatory, and it cannot be made up for with prostration. So, because of that, if a person's praying 4 rakats, right, of dhuhr, for instance, right, and they get to the 4th rakat, they make this first sajda, sit, second sajda, they're supposed to sit for the tashahhud. Right? If they don't sit at all and they just stand straight up to the 5th rak'ah, right, then what do? Right? As long as they don't reach the sajda of the 5th rak'ah, then they have to return to the sitting position. They return immediately to the sitting position, regardless of where they are in the fifth rak'ah. If they're in their bowing, they realize, oh wait, I didn't sit. They just go straight to the sitting position, right? And then they carry out the tashahhud as they're supposed to, and then they prostrate for forgetfulness, right? Because they did not secure the fifth rak'ah by making the sajda. Once you make the sajda of the additional rak'ah, that rak'ah it counts. You can't go back now. Right. So if you didn't sit at all and you stood for the fifth rak'ah and you haven't made the sajda yet, you sit right back down and you make the prostration of forgetfulness. Right. If you did make the sajda, then the prayer that you made, those first four rak'ahs that you made, are no longer, they don't count for your fard. They don't count as your obligatory prayer, but they do count as a nafl prayer. Right. So if it's dhuhr prayer, it's not, you didn't pray dhuhr, but you do get the reward for 4 rakats of nafl. So you still have to go back and pray dhuhr again. So it doesn't count as an obligatory prayer. In that case, it is recommended to continue to a 6th prayer, a 6th rak'ah as well, because if you break the prayer after just doing the 5th rak'ah, right, then that's only 1 rak'ah. Right, the first 4 are nafl, and then you got 1 rak'ah just hanging there. Right? It's recommended to add a 6th so that it's a pair. And then you get the 4 rakats in the beginning are nafl, and the 2 rakats are also considered nafl. So you get the reward of all of that. However, since you did not intentionally start that second pair, the 5th and 6th rakat, right, it is not obligatory on you if you just break the prayer. Because we mentioned that only if you intentionally start a voluntary prayer is it obligatory for you to finish it, or necessary. Right? So you can just say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, and just leave the prayer. And then just start over your dhuhr prayer again. Or you can add a 6th rakat, then you get the reward of a full prayer of nafl, and then you make your dhuhr again. That's if you did not sit at all in the final sitting. Right? In the final sitting, the length of time it takes to say the tashahhud. That's the obligatory. Right? If you did sit, you sat for the full tashahhud, but then, right, and somehow it came to your mind that this is the first sitting, so I have to stand up. So you stand up to what's actually the 5th rak'ah. Right? And then you realize, wait, that was the final sitting. I'm supposed to just finish the prayer. Right? If you did not reach the sajda of the 5th rak'ah, so then the 5th rak'ah is not yet secured. If you make the sajda, then it's secured. Right? If you don't reach the sajda of the 5th rak'ah, you just make salam. Right? It's recommended to actually sit down and then make the salam. Right? And the 4 rakats counts as your dhuhr. It counts as your obligatory prayer. Right? However, since you did start into the 5th prayer, if you reach if you reach the prostration of the 5th prayer, the 5th rak'ah, then that secures the 5th rak'ah. It's recommended to add a 6th to complete the pair. The 4 is already valid. The 4 is valid. Right? Then you would have a 2 extra on the end. But that 2 extra on the end does not count for your emphasized sunnah after dhuhr. It does not count for your emphasized sunnah after dhuhr. Right? Even though you might want it to. Now the same rule applies, that it's recommended to complete the pair even if it's fajr or asr. Even if it's fajr or asr. Right? Even though it is disliked to pray voluntary prayers after the fajr prayer and after the asr prayer, right, this is an exception, because it will technically be counted as 2 rakats of voluntary prayer after the fajr prayer. Right? But it's still recommended to complete the pair. But you don't have to. You can either just make salam wherever you are. If you're standing, just make salam. Your obligatory prayer is finished. Or you can return to the sitting and finish it. And that's the best. Or you can add a 6th rakat to complete the prayer. Right, so just to reiterate really quickly, if you definitely sat for the last sitting. You completed all the obligations of the prayer. Everything's done. The only thing that's left is the salam. Right? But you accidentally stood up to a 5th rakat. If you did not reach the sajda, you immediately sit back down, right? And you make salam. That's the best. Or you just make salam standing. Right? If you did make the sajda of the 5th rakat, then you you have the choice to add a 6th rakat, which is best, which is recommended to complete the prayer. However, if you were to just leave the prayer as well, then the obligatory prayer counts, and you do not have to make up the two voluntary rakats at the end to them. The last issue, right, I believe we covered all of them. Right, so if we just look at this, right, it's a fard prayer. If it's the first sitting, then if you sat for the first sitting, right, and then you stood up for a 3rd rak'ah. All right, sorry, you didn't sit at all for the first sitting, right, and you stood up to go to the 3rd rak'ah, then you realize, oh wait, I didn't sit. If you're closer to sitting, you sit, no prostration. Right, NP. If you're closer to standing, then you stand, right, and you do prostrate. If it's the last sitting, which is obligatory, right, if you didn't sit at all, right, then if you didn't reach the sajda of the 5th rakat, then you return to the sitting position, and you make a prostration for forgetfulness after the tashahhud. If you didn't sit at all and you did reach the prostration, then that obligatory prayer does not count as obligatory, but it counts as voluntary. Right? But you don't have to make the prostration. Right? And then it's recommended, obviously, to add a 6th rakat. If you did sit, right, then regardless of whether you reach the sajda of the 5th rakat or not, the prayer is valid. Your dhuhr is done, your asr is done, whatever it may be. Right? Right, so all you would do is either just sit right back down and make the salam, or salam from where you were, right? But it's still recommended to make a 6th rak'ah. Right? And that's pretty much all we wanted to cover for today. The next class we'll be talking about the prayer of the sick person. Right? And the sick person means the one who has some sort of difficulty that does not allow them to either stand or to prostrate or to do any of that. Right? They're so sick that they can't stand, they have pain, they have whatever issue they have, they can't stand. That has its own rulings. They have issues where they can stand, they can bow, but they can't sit, or they can't prostrate. Then that has separate rulings. We'll take that in the next class. Insha'Allah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Are there any questions before we close? Actually, I think I skipped one thing. Apologies. Just really quickly, there's one last issue that Imam Quduri covers in 3 lines. I just really want to just whiz through this. It's not so difficult because it all connects to this. And then the prayer of the sick person comes. If a person has doubts in their prayer of how many rakats that they prayed, right, then there's 3 things that could happen, 3 possibilities of acting, what to do. The first, if that never happened to you before, or it's not something that usually happens to you before, then it's best to start the prayer over. It's best to start the prayer over from the beginning. Right, so this never happens, but you're mid-dhuhr prayer, and is this 2 rakat, 2nd rakat, or is this a 3rd rakat? Is this the 3rd or the 4th? Then it's better, if it's not normal at all for you, then you should start the prayer over. Right, then you would start the prayer over. However, in our times, it's very rare that that's not happened to anyone, customarily. Right, it is something quite normal in our times. If it is something that does happen occasionally to you, or does happen once in a while, or even happens often to you, then the next 2 possibilities are there. The first is the best, and this is what everyone should practice on. The last one is there. The last of the 3 circumstances is there, but this one is the one to practice on. If it's something that does happen to you occasionally or often, right, then you choose. Right, if you're doubt, is it 3 or 4? Is it 2 or 3? Choose. Make a choice. Right. While if you have to think a bit, then you should continue your recitation, or you should continue to make some sort of dhikr, because then it would not be considered a delay. Right? If you're say you're in ruku' and you don't know, is this third or fourth? So just continue, Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil Azim, until you can figure it out. But make a choice, A or B, 3 or 4, 2 or 3. I'm not sure. Choose, pick one. Whatever you choose, you act on that. You don't have to make a prostration of forgetfulness. Whatever you choose, and you act on that, because you're acting on reasonable surety, and reasonable surety takes the place of certainty when certainty is not possible. Right? If you act on reasonable surety or certainty, you don't have to prostrate for forgetfulness. Right? So I choose it's 3. Okay, act as if it's 3. No prostration. Okay? The other criteria that they mentioned, that if you don't really have any surety at all, any reasonable surety, then you would act on what's certain. So if it's 2 or 3, what's certain is definitely was 2. Definitely I prayed 2. Right? If I doubt whether I prayed 3 or 4, I definitely prayed 3. It's just the doubt is in the 4. So I act on the 3. But that should not be practiced on for anyone who has constant misgivings. Anyone who has any even to a small extent, that are suffering with waswasa, act on the second one. A or B, that's it. Right? Quickly decide A or B, and whatever you decide, you act on that. You don't have to make a prostration. And completely ignore whatever you think about after the prayer. Right? Now, if the scholars do mention that if you have doubts of how many rakats you prayed after you already made the final tashahhud, ignore it. Right, so you're in the final sitting, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu, and then it comes to your mind, wait, is this the 3rd rak'ah? Am I supposed to do a 4th rak'ah? Ignore it. Right, because you already finished all the integrals of the prayer. Right? The only thing that is left is the salam. Right? So you cannot go back. Right? If later on you have some sort of flash of absolute certainty that you definitely did not pray 4, you prayed 3, then make it up. But that's rare. You need very strong proof for that. Tamam. So that's all we wanted to cover. Inshallah, next week we'll do the prayer of the sick person. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Apologies for going over the time. Jazakumullah khair. If there are any questions, then you can just send them to, type them, and then I'll answer them by typing, inshallah, so that Shaykh Faraz can take the next class.
If someone is reciting one juz in both rak'ahs, how is the first one longer?
If someone is reciting the one juz in 2 rak'ahs, how is the first rak'ah longer? If you recite 3/4 of the juz in the first rak'ah and 1/4 of the juz in the last and the second, it'll be longer. Right? The first one will be longer than the second. Right? It's not longer standing, it's long standing. So long standing is better than multiple, or than a large number of rak'ahs. Right? So if you read a whole juz over 20 rakats, then you're going to have a lot of rakats. But if you read that same juz in 4 rakats, then the standings are going to be much longer, and that's more preferred.